For 15 years now, I've thought about one topic more than anything else. How can I supercharge my career? This question has been a constant throughout my entire journey in the tech industry, starting from 2009 when I was a Stanford computer science student, and then after graduation, joining a startup which got acquired by Pinterest, failing literally hundreds of interviews throughout my journey, including failing my first few internships and not getting a return offer. Joining Pinterest for a few years before I joined Meta, where I finally felt like I had attained some level of success. I made $800,000 as a staff engineer and manager. And then finally leaving big tech 2 years ago to start my own company. Throughout that whole journey, I've always thought about how could I have done better? How could I make sure the people around me who I care about could also thrive in their career? In this video, I'm gonna package up 15 years of my experience and share it with you of what I wish I knew as I was coming up. Before we go too much deeper, I wanna share a warning with you. Software engineering is a huge field, tons of nuances, and a ton of depth. And that's actually a really cool and fun part of working in the industry. But that also means that there is no such thing as being an overnight success in our industry. If you're not able to sit down and watch more than 5 minutes of this video, you're gonna have a really hard time in the tech industry. You need to have patience. And even after watching this video, you're not going to magically become an amazing software engineer. This is a starting point to lay the foundation for a really amazing career. I have wasted so many hours and thousands of dollars on dead ends and suboptimal ways of learning how to become a really good engineer. I'm going to save you from that grief through this video. I've broken down this video into 5 different categories for each part of your career. So first of all, how do you attain the fundamental skills, the ability of writing and debugging code that's going to serve you throughout your career? Second is networking. Your ability to connect and help and get help from the people around you is going to dictate how far you go. Third is getting a job. How do you interview effectively? How do you get the interview? We'll talk about the different types of assessment that you're going to come across. Fourth is you've gotten the job. How do you now succeed on the job? How do you improve once you've gotten the job? Things like working with your manager, onboarding, asking for a promotion. And then finally, I want to spend some time talking about how do you fight for yourself? How do you do skillful self-advocacy where you can actually think about what do I want to do next in my career? How do I figure out the right company? How do I ask for what I want? That's a skill that I think a lot of engineers are lacking in. If you absorb and apply all the lessons in this video, you're going to be far, far ahead of me at any point in my career. And you're also going to be far ahead of almost everyone else coming up in the tech industry. I hope it's helpful. Let's start off by talking about the foundation for any software engineer, which is the ability to write code. How do you learn to write effective code? How do you write good code? And the answer is very simple. You learn to write code by writing a lot of it. But the nuance here is how you write the code. And this is where a lot of people, most people, will screw up. You've heard this expression called tutorial hell. And it's hell because you're spending a lot of time and energy in tutorials, and actually you don't get the outcome that you're looking for, which is properly learning how to code. So I'm going to plot out for you the relationship between writing code and tutorials and how they interplay with each other. So on the y-axis we have time, and then on the y-axis we have the value of a tutorial. So when you're starting off, you know nothing about coding. Tutorials are actually incredibly helpful. They give you a step-by-step guide on what you should do, how you should do it, and that hand-holding, those training wheels, are incredibly valuable. So you start off with a ton of value. But as you become more experienced, they start to lose their value because you're not really learning much if you just copy-paste whatever the instructor is doing. And so it goes down in value. And what is ironic, or what is really interesting, is that as you become more senior, the tutorials actually end up hurting you. They poison your ability to be creative and take the training wheels off because now you've become so reliant on the tutorial. And so it falls into negative. And that is what I would describe as tutorial hell, where you're so dependent on the tutorial that you lose the ability to write original software on your own, and therefore you are no longer an effective engineer. I would not want to hire someone who needs that level of handholding. One of the beautiful things, and also one of the challenging things about coding, about the tech industry, is that code is infinitely malleable. So if I give you a problem, I can promise you there are going to be thousands of ways, infinite number of ways to tackle that problem. And the issue with the tutorial is that it is showing you one way, one reasonably good way of tackling that problem, but it's likely not going to be the way that you would have come up with your own solution. And the learning happens in that exploration, where you try out different solutions, you figure out the pros and cons, and you might come up with an equally good solution, which just happened to be deviate from the tutorial. And you rob yourself of that opportunity if you're so blindly focused on following the tutorial. And this is also the reason why I'm not a big fan of books or certificates. The same problem applies here, where because you're so focused on reading a book or passing a certificate, you're not really giving your brain the opportunity to be creative and explore, which is where the true learning how to code happens. And so if earlier in my career, when I was learning Java, for example, I would go to the library and literally pull out a book about Java and spend half an hour every night reading a chapter. And what a complete waste of time. Reading how to program is not the same as programming. And you're not going to really achieve much or learn much if you are reading and you don't have your hands on the keyboard. One of the things that I feel like people get hung up on when I give them the advice is that they somehow have this mental block of messing up because they've gone through the school system where they're rewarded for having the correct answer and they're punished for having the wrong answer. And again, this is why I love software, and this is why I love the tech industry. There's very little or no cost to failure. If you're following a tutorial or if you're trying to build your own project, which is what I'd recommend, you can screw up, you can see the compilation error, you can see why there was a crash, and then you can go back and fix it. And you can do that all within a few seconds. And so if you work hard and you're okay to tolerate discomfort, you're okay to tolerate not knowing what's happening and just fool around, you can get really, really far within a day, within a week, within a few months, and that will allow you to learn the code at a much, much deeper level compared to anyone else who is using the guardrails or the training wheels that come from a tutorial or a book or a certificate. And finally, one thing I want to share is from my own experience. I got into Android while I started working at Pinterest. And I kind of muddled my way through. I was able to follow some tutorials. I was able to copy the code in a certain way to make whatever change I wanted to make. I never really truly understood how do I do Android. And ironically, the first time I felt confident in my ability to develop Android apps is when I started teaching Android. So I signed up to teach for this boot camp, and in the process of teaching, I went through a tutorial literally 4 or 5 times. I went through the exact same tutorial, and then I started to extend it in a certain way. And I made my own custom modification. And that was where I had enough depth of understanding where I could tell you exactly what every line of code was doing, why it was important, and what would happen if I change it from this line to that line. And that is what I'd encourage you to do, is go deep. So even if you have a tutorial, that's fine. Use it as a starting point. But then I want you to break the tutorial. I want you to extend it. I want you to go much, much deeper into it. And teaching is actually an effective way of forcing yourself to do that, where teach it to yourself or teach it to another person. And that will force a level of clarity that is incredibly important for your maturation as a software engineer learning to code. Hopefully you have a good idea now of learning how to code. And what you'll notice is that I didn't talk too much about the quality of the code, making the code pristine and maintainable. That comes next. First, we focus on raw output, just quantity of coding. Don't worry about messing up. And now let's talk about how do you write code, clean code, quality code that is fit to be on a team. Any professional engineer, you're going to be working with a team of people. How do you make sure the code you write is a good fit for that environment? And the same advice is applicable here as what I just told you. The way you write clean, high quality code is you write a bunch of bad code first. So don't worry about the process to get there. You have to go through the pain of bad code. And then in that process, you will get to the point of good code. It's kind of like children who you might come across a child who's like, I want to skip past being a child and being a teenager. I want to go straight to adulthood. And you can't really do that. You have to go through the maturation, the pain of growing up, and then you become an adult. So the same thing is true here. You can't just blindly copy the code patterns or the templates used by senior engineers at FANG. You have to understand the why behind these different code constructs. And again, the pain is your friend here. So when I talk about the pain of writing bad code, I'm talking about that manifesting in 3 different ways. First is you. When you write bad code, you're going to figure out that a week later or a month later, you'll have no idea what you were talking about. And it's going to take you a long, long time to even ramp up on what does that variable name mean? Why did I extend the class in this way? And that'll be a reminder to yourself that, okay, let me make sure I don't mess this up again. Second, and this is I think even more valuable, is if you have the privilege of working on a really solid team, then you're going to have a lot of pain and feedback coming from your teammates in code review. And that's going to be an amazing source of how to get better at the craft of engineering and writing good code. And then finally, inevitably, you're going to have a lot of bugs in your code, a lot of anti-patterns, and that's going to cause issue for the end user. And so you might have literally a million people who are relying and running on your code, and you screw something up. It certainly happened to me. It's happened to every engineer I've talked to working at Pinterest or Facebook, where they deployed something and it crashed for a lot of people. That's a really quick way to learn. Well, let's not do that again. And let's make sure that we have preventive measures to avoid that kind of mistake in the future. So this goes back to what I said earlier. You can't jump ahead. You can't skip the messy part. The journey, the pain that you get from writing a lot of bad code is how you end up writing good code. Tactically, if you are on a team and you have a code review process, I would really encourage you to invest a lot of your time in looking at the feedback you got on your own code. And also, you can look at the feedback that other people have received on their code. You don't just have to learn from your mistakes, learn from the mistakes of other people. And that's a really good way to accelerate the quality of code that you write. We've talked about learning to code. We've talked about writing good code. I want to talk about another really core component of being an effective engineer, which is debugging. And this is actually, I would say, the hardest part. Reading code is harder than writing code. And reading code is how you debug code. The idea here is that you've deployed some system, and of course, things go wrong. Things always go wrong, especially when you are working at a scale where you have millions or billions of users. And so your ability to go in, understand a system that you might not be very familiar with, and then making a change, that is such an important skill and such a valuable skill as an engineer. Before I go into some tactics to help you debug, I want to share why is debugging so important. So number one, if you work in any kind of sophisticated code base, you will always have bugs. And as humans, as long as humans are going to be programmers, there will always be bugs. Therefore, debugging is something which will always have value. And that's in contrast to feature development. So I worked at Facebook for a long time. Turns out that probably more than half of the features that engineers work on end up not ever seeing the light of day. Or they might see the light of day briefly and they get killed. A lot of features, especially in big tech, don't actually make it to production. They don't really end up moving the needle. And so you could spend all this time working on a feature only to not really see any benefit from it. On the other hand, debugging always has value. If you are removing a crash or improving a feature, that will always have value for you, the company, and the end user. And finally, like I said earlier, debugging is quite challenging. Reading code means that you have a mastery or at least a decent understanding of the end-to-end flow of a software system. And that becomes incredibly valuable, especially in a large tech company where people have changed teams, there's a lot of churn, and the complexity is enormous. In fact, one of the most senior engineers I worked with, he was like an E8 engineer at Facebook, easily this person got paid more than $1 million a year. One of the superpowers that they had was an ability to diagnose an issue and debug it, put out a fix very quickly in a way that a lot of engineers simply could not do, or if they were able to do it, it would take them 10x or 20x longer. And so that's a good example of if you're able to master the skill of debugging, you can reap enormous rewards for yourself, and it's a huge, huge impact in a large enough company. Hopefully now you are convinced about the importance of debugging. And in fact, you could make your whole career built off the brand of being a master debugger. The person I talked about who made more than $1 million a year, they actually fit that archetype. So there's a staff engineer archetype called Fixer, and the whole idea is that you're able to go into a system, even if you're not familiar with it, and figure out what went wrong and put out a fix. So I want to share with you the playbook on how you could become a debugger. And this could actually be a really fun process because software, for the most part, is instructions to the computer. And your goal is to have a really solid understanding of that end-to-end flow. What are you telling the computer to do? And how does that line up, or maybe not line up, with what you are seeing in the output to cause a bug? And so the way you can illustrate this is you have a bug here somewhere. And now your objective is to figure out where it came from. So it's actually not that difficult, and it could be fun to play detective. So you have this deterministic set of things that are happening. For example, let's say there's a rendering issue when you go to a particular screen on mobile. Figure out what happens when you go from one screen to another, and where is that API call happening, the JSON parsing happening. Really be concrete about everything that you are instructing the computer to do. And you go through each step. You figure out where that mismatch is happening. Let's say it's happening at the JSON parsing step. Now, you know that the bug is introduced somewhere in those 25, 50 lines of code that are doing the JSON parsing for your app. So this really just boils down to being really logical and writing things down in an organized way so you can hone in on where that bug is likely to be introduced. So a big part of this actually is about knowing your toolkit. So for example, at Meta, it's such a big and complicated company that you actually have a lot of custom tools internally to figure out when did a certain mobile app get released, how do you do the custom parsing that JSON is doing, that Meta is doing, how do you know at what stage your rollout is happening. There's a lot of different things that you could investigate. So a big part of debugging actually is understanding your toolkit. Figure out the internals of different programs or Android Studio or different ways to diagnose API calls. And if you have a really solid understanding of that, you can get really adept at quickly figuring out bugs and be the hero for your team. Some of you watching might be in school, or perhaps you're working, but you are thinking about going back to school for a master's or a PhD. I want to share with you a couple of my own reflections and realizations about the academic journey, having been out of school for so long now. The number one thing I'll tell you is that school does not adequately prepare you for a job. Your grades are actually not that important. By far, the more important thing that you get from school is the network that you develop, the students that you come across, the faculty that you're able to interact with. And I think there's a huge misconception here where when I think about what people perceive as the amount of skill on the y-axis, like here's what you need as a junior eng. That's the amount of skill that you need in order to thrive and do well as a junior engineer in the industry. And people think that, okay, if I go to school, I'll be well prepared, I'm going to hit that skill bar. Turns out the amount of skill that school will give you is a small fraction of what you actually need. And I'm not saying that school has no value. I'll talk about some of the reasons why it has a huge amount of value. But in terms of the practical application of what you need in order to do version control and collaborate with a team and learn modern programming languages, an academic institute will not prepare you for that. And so there's this huge delta that you now need to make up. And how do you do that? That is where the other parts of school become really, really valuable for you. So when you think about school, only one part of the value is academic, like the actual knowledge that you gain. I would say that the majority of the things I learned at Stanford are not really that applicable to me. Second is the network. And third are life skills, right? And I think a lot of people neglect 2 and 3. Whereas that way, like learning how to do your laundry and cook and be independent, that's actually quite valuable. And I would say the most important thing by far is that you're surrounded by people who are like-minded, ambitious, and smart. And so the network is an amazing asset that you get. And they're the ones, the people you work with, are the ones who are going to teach you how to do practical coding. They'll often refer you to internships or jobs. Professors are actually hugely valuable because these are people who are at the top of their field and they're really well connected. In fact, my first job out of college was at a startup called Kosei. It came because a professor of mine at Stanford decided to do his own company. And I worked with him and he said, "Hey, Rahul, it seems like you kind of know what you're doing. Do you want to join me in the startup?" And I said, "Sure, I'll do that." I literally got a full-time job just because I had a pretty good relationship with a faculty member at Stanford. One thing I think I really overdid when it came to my college experience was the emphasis on grades. One of the nice things about the tech industry and being a software engineer in particular is that the best way to showcase what you've done is to just build things. And doing a theoretical class in an academic environment, yeah, I mean, it helps to have good grades, but it's certainly not the most representative of your skills. And so if I could do it over, I honestly would have spent less time on academics and I would have spent way more time building side projects with really interesting people at Stanford. For example, one of the most difficult classes I took at Stanford was compilers. And they had this really draconian policy the professor had where every hour after midnight that you would submit the assignment, you would automatically get your grade reduced by a certain percent. And so if you didn't finish the assignment on time, you had this really difficult decision on, okay, should I stay up late and lose sleep and lose valuable time in order to try and get more of the assignment done while also combating the reduction in grade that's going to happen? And it just led to a really bad situation where I felt like I wasted time for a marginal increase in my grade and I was really stressed out. And if I could have done it over, I would have submitted what I had, cut my losses, and taken perhaps a lower grade, but I would have been able to allocate more time toward the other things that I think are equally or more important when you are in school. The next big topic I want to talk about is networking. How do you build up a cohort of people who you can know really well, you can help them and they can help you? And if you look at any high-level engineer, any executive-level person, the way they succeed is almost entirely based off of the people they know. And the people they know allow them to have the impact required to succeed at that high level. A very common misconception here, especially among engineers, is that they think the corporate world is a dark place with a lot of political players, a lot of Machiavellian tactics to try and get ahead. And you put people down and it's all politics. And that people assume networking and politics are intertwined and politics is this negative, dark thing that they don't want to engage in. And I'm not denying that there are people who are like that, where they're really just selfish and trying to take advantage of other people around them. But I will also say that unless you engage with people and you do it in a productive way, you will not get ahead in your career. There's a phrase I like a lot called, your network is your net worth. So your ability to cultivate relationships and not just get help, but also provide value to people, that is how you are going to become wealthy. That's how you increase your net worth. Just to make it really simple, my number one rule with networking is give more than you take. Lead with kindness. So when you are talking to the new person on the team, or maybe you are the new person on the team, your first question when you interact with someone in a one-on-one or a team meeting is, what value can I offer? How can I help this person? And you should not expect that they're going to immediately repay the favor or be able to help you in return. The idea should be, let me plant a bunch of seeds. Let me try and help as many people as possible. And then maybe either tomorrow or a week from now or a year from now, years from now, some of them might come back and be able to help me out as well. The world works in a really random way sometimes. And so when you are trying to help people genuinely, they'll remember that and that will benefit you in your career later on. A lot of the jobs I've gotten have actually come through my network. We'll talk about this later on in the video, but referrals and someone advocating for you is probably the best way for you to build up a career and get into jobs that you probably wouldn't have had access to otherwise. One really concrete story, which has had a huge, profound impact on my life, is when I joined Meta. So right now I'm working on a company called Taro. My co-founder is Alex. We first overlapped. We first met each other while working at Facebook on a team called Portal, which is a really chaotic organization. And I joined Portal about 4 or 5 months after him. He was still relatively new, but he knew certainly more than what I knew. And so as I was trying to navigate the chaos and confusion that came in with being new into big tech and also being new into this pretty messy org, he actually created his own onboarding doc for me. And he had no incentive to do so. It was purely an act of kindness that, hey, I'm lost, but I'm a little bit less lost than you. Maybe I could help you out. And that doc ended up being really valuable for me. We ended up striking up a friendship on that team, and we maintained that relationship even after Alex moved to Instagram away from Portal. And eventually, that relationship turned into starting a company together. So I'm not going to promise that you're going to find a co-founder magically by networking, but that's an example of the way you get lucky, the way you're able to find people and opportunities that other people are not able to get is through this idea of leading with kindness. And that is how you build up your network. That's how you're able to get a huge outcome. All right, so one of the things that naturally comes up when we talk about networking is I'm new and everyone around me just seems so much more put together, so much smarter than me. And we call this imposter syndrome. And everyone I've talked to, whether they're extremely smart or not so much, they're kind of average like me, they will feel imposter syndrome. And so it's worth spending a couple minutes talking about that. The first thing to mention is that we are so lucky to be in an industry where we have incredibly smart people that we feel imposter syndrome. So the first thing I'll say is reframe the fear or the anxiety that comes with imposter syndrome and view it instead as an opportunity that we now have so many people around us to be able to learn from. So I'm going to try and illustrate how imposter syndrome will manifest usually, and then I'll talk about a couple ways to combat it. So a very common time when you might feel imposter syndrome is you just got promoted to a new level or you're new to a company. And so, you're down here. This is you. And then, you might feel, okay, everyone else, they know so much more about a topic. They're already at a much higher level. They've been at the company for so much longer. So all the people up here are way more knowledgeable than me. And there's a huge gap. There's a delta between what you know and what they know. And that can be scary. It's like, I might say something stupid, or I might screw up, or I don't deserve to have this promotion or this job. So a couple things I would say. First, instead of viewing everyone up here as this big blob of people who are all so much smarter than you, it really helps to decompose that. Build up an individual relationship with certain people in that blob. And that's where you can start to figure out, hey, there's a particular person over here who, yeah, they for sure know way more about this topic, but actually I might know a little bit more about this other topic. And when you start to figure out that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, you can figure out how you can have unique value on the team. The second thing is going back to what I said earlier. Let's reframe imposter syndrome as an opportunity for us to learn an incredible amount from people who are a little bit further ahead than us in a particular domain. So think about how each person here is effectively going to give you a ladder that now you can get to the level that they are at. And you have the opportunity to learn from them and become so much better. And then the last thing I'd say is that feedback is a gift. And we'll talk a lot more about this in a later section. But a lot of the imposter syndrome, a lot of the anxiety will come from ambiguity on how are you doing. You're new to a company and you're not really sure how are you doing relative to the expectation at that level. And so just ask a bunch of questions, obviously to your manager, but also to the people who you think you're putting on that pedestal. Ask them and say, hey, how am I doing? I have a question about this particular topic, or I've been on the team for X number of weeks and I'm not really sure if I'm ramping up quickly enough. Would you be able to share some frank feedback with me? And when you get that feedback, you can not only improve, but also you might find out that, hey, you're actually doing totally fine. At this point in the job or at this point in the promotion, people are not expecting you to magically know everything. And having that really concrete discussion can help to alleviate a lot of the stress that comes from imposter syndrome. The next big section I want to talk about is interviewing, which is a necessary evil when it comes to thriving in tech. You need to get a job, right? So I want to start off by talking about what are proven techniques to help you find a job. If I had known this earlier, I would have gotten much further. I would not have had to deal with literally hundreds of rejections earlier in my career. So the first thing I want to call out is that you should not expect that finding a job is a completely fair, transparent process. It's not how the world works, unfortunately. So consider, for example, a normal job application, a job description. So normally what will happen is you're going to have, when this job posting goes up on LinkedIn or Indeed, you might have, I've heard, thousands of applications coming in within a day. And so you are one of hundreds or thousands of people competing. It's really hard to distinguish yourself and be able to get an interview, forget about even getting a job. And so one of the lenses through which you should think about your interview process and finding a job is I want you to find jobs where instead of 1,000 people, you might only be one of maybe 3 people who are applying for the job. And how do you put yourself in a position where you can be one of 3 people or one of 10 people instead of one of 1,000 people? That is the question you should ask yourself. And the answer to that is you need to figure out, where do you have unfair advantages? Where do you have unfair access to jobs? So a good one for me was I went to Stanford. Stanford has tons and tons of companies that want to recruit from Stanford. And so when I went to the career fair, that was a huge unfair advantage that I was able to land interviews and eventually get internships and jobs because I was at the top of the list through the Stanford Career Fair. You probably have a career fair as well if you're in university. Go to that. That's a huge source for being able to get a job. If you're not in college or if you don't have a really prestigious name on your resume, you can still find opportunities, find ways to distinguish yourself. So maybe you have made an open source contribution into some repository. Now you have an unfair advantage that you have credibility of expertise in a domain in a way that other people don't have. Maybe you have this deep, deep passion for a particular industry like healthcare, and you've worked in healthcare before and now you're transitioning. Okay, now you have an unfair advantage to apply for tech jobs in the healthcare industry. So figure out what is that for you, where you can actually start to compete with a lot fewer people compared to, a generic posting at Google where now you're applying on LinkedIn and you have literally thousands or tens of thousands of people competing with you. The next thing to realize is that interviews are really random and frankly kind of broken. So one thing that is worth thinking about is the empathy for the company. If you are trying to hire a good engineer, you probably will expect they'll be on your team for a couple of years, and yet you're trying to make a decision about, can this person be an effective engineer, an effective leader on my team, probably within 3 or 4 or 5 hours. It's a pretty hard job. You should expect, the company will expect, and you should also expect that there's a lot of random things that will happen, a lot of unknowns that you really can't account for. And that could either help you in a positive way, or more likely, companies are really cautious to taking a bet on people, and it might hurt you. And that's part of the process. You should be okay with that. And your mentality going into the job search is really, really important here. When I talk to so many people at this point, and in my own career, there are kind of 2 approaches to a job interview, right? Approach number 1 is you are extremely stressed out and you are coming in with a ton of anxiety and you feel like it's make or break. Either I perform well and I get the job, or I'm screwed. My life is ruined. And there's another approach as well, which is what I recommend, which is, hey, this is an opportunity for me to meet someone really interesting. I can learn from them. I want to learn about the company. And if this is a good fit, I'd love to explore where it goes. But you are not hinging your career or your life on this particular job or interview. And when you have that mentality of, hey, YOLO, I promise that you're going to end up doing much, much better in the interview and in the actual job too, where you come in with this positive, dynamic attitude that you can adapt and adjust based on how the interview is going. So what I like to tell people is study a lot, care a little. Obviously, you should do all the preparation. We'll talk about a lot of the tactics in a little bit, but do all the leak code preparation, do mock interviews, work with your friends or colleagues to do practice interviews. Once you've done all that work though, and you're going to the interview, go in with confidence, go in with a clear head, be dynamic, be prepared for anything. And don't be so hung up on, oh, that question was phrased in a different way, or I'm not sure how to handle this. Come into it with the right attitude and your success rate is going to shoot up dramatically. The last thing I want to mention on this topic of finding a job is that you should allocate enough time to it. I think some people have this kind of miracle mindset where it's, oh, there's a perfect job, I'm going to apply for it, everyone's going to love me, I'm going to love the company, it's going to work out. It almost never works out. You should come into it with plenty of backup options. You should come into it with plenty of time allocated and really have a consistent schedule for preparing for interviews. One of the things that does suck about the industry is that the preparation for a job and the actual job are very different. And so just doing well on your current job is not actually going to prepare you adequately to interview effectively. On that note, one of the common issues that I've seen people have again and again and again is that they are not correctly taking into account how far along, or their lack thereof, of how far along they are in the interview process. There's two very distinct phases when it comes to job searching. First is, do you have interviews lined up? Can you get interviews? And the second phase, which is actually very distinct from that, is, are you now passing the interview? And the common mistake I see is that people will jump to phase number 2, trying to pass the interview when they haven't actually done the work for phase number 1. So phase number 2, passing the interview, is all about grinding out data structure algorithm problems, looking at system design, doing behavioral interviews, and we'll talk about all of those in a bit. But you can't jump prematurely to phase 2 when you haven't actually had interviews lined up. And so if you're still on phase 1, you need to do things like networking. You need to go to the career fair. You need to figure out what is your unfair advantage, where you can actually distinguish yourself from hundreds of other applicants. Once you have the confidence that you have 2, 3, 10 different interviews lined up, that you can get those on the calendar, then you shift aggressively into phase 2, which is what we're going to talk about in the subsequent section. So in the 2 phases of finding a job, phase 1 is getting the interview, phase 2 is passing the interview. So a big part of phase 1, getting the interview, is having a really good resume, a highlight reel of your professional achievements so that people can look at it and then decide whether to interview you or not. So obviously, the resume is critical. It is probably the single most important document of your professional life. I have a couple of rules I want to share with you on how to make your resume actually stand out. And I'll tell you, from looking at hundreds, or probably at this point thousands of resumes, the majority of them are bad. Not just bad, but they are flaming garbage. I would never hire someone or never even interview someone with a lot of the resumes that I have seen. A very common mistake I see is people who have resumes with a lot of flowery language, a really unique format. They think, hey, I'm a unique person, I have a unique personality. My resume should be unique too. I'm going to have a bunch of different colors, and I'm going to have 4 columns and a lot of really cool pictures. That is not how you succeed with a resume. The resume should be laser focused on highlighting your professional accomplishments. People don't spend very much time looking at it. Within 10 seconds, within 8 seconds, they are going to make a judgment about whether they think you have what it takes to succeed at the company, and whether they put you in the yes pile or the maybe or no pile. And frankly, maybe and no both turn into no at the end of the day. One of the really easy ways for me as a hiring manager to get turned off on your resume is very simple: length. So a lot of people think that, okay, I have so many different things I've done. I've done 3 internships, I followed 5 tutorials, and so therefore I have 5 projects. I have all these clubs and activities and hobbies that I want to showcase, and they have, a resume which ends up being 4 or 5 pages long. And if someone is spending 8 or 10 seconds looking at your resume, the vast majority of that is going to be completely ignored. And the information density, the amount of information you communicate in that 8 or 10 seconds, is a lot lower compared to if you have one really tight resume, which just talks about the highlights of what you've accomplished and why you are a good fit for that role. And so my recommendation is follow a very clean, standardized format: 1 page, 1 column, no headshot. And no summary section. That's a really common mistake I've seen, where people will spend 4 or 5 sentences, maybe even 1 or 2 paragraphs at the top of their resume talking about, hey, I'm a hard worker, I want this kind of job, I lead teams effectively. And that's a waste of space, and you're not really communicating anything of value. One of the core principles in having a good resume is show, don't tell. And inevitably, when you have that 4 or 5 sentence paragraph at the top talking about how you're a hard worker, how you are ambitious and you want a really cool opportunity, that is classic telling. You're not really proving anything. Anyone could make that claim. So instead, you should go directly into the substance of what you've accomplished in your internships or projects or your jobs and talk about what have you achieved, what metrics have you moved, what technology were you using, and show me the numbers that prove what you are claiming. A really good example of being ruthless with the size of your resume is my co-founder. So I'll leave the link so you can dive deeper into the template that he followed. But in his resume, he has published literally more than 30 different Android apps. He's one of the most prolific mobile developers and Android developers I know. He has many apps that have gotten more than 100,000 downloads. And yet, when you look at his resume, he has picked the top 2 out of 30 different apps he has published. And each of these 2 have more than 500,000 downloads. And so that's a really good demonstration of how you need to really figure out what are the top few things that will fit, that will clear the bar for a 1-page resume. Brevity is your friend here. And Alex doesn't have a 10-page resume, even though he easily could. He focused on the top 2 because that will capture all the value that he was able to create from the lesser projects. It's focus on the pinnacle of what you've achieved. Okay, now let's talk about what I'm sure is your favorite subject, or perhaps your least favorite subject ever, which is data structure and algorithm interviews. This is a core part of how many companies will evaluate a software engineer. And I'll just be really honest, it does suck, because I mentioned this a little bit before. The DSA interview is necessary for you to pass and for you to go deep on that subject in order to get the job. But you'll find that when you are actually a professional software engineer, you will almost never use the concepts that you've learned. The classic joke is that, how often are you going to actually be reversing a linked list or doing some contrived thing with a binary tree on the job? And the answer is not really ever. And yet, it still is the state of the industry that is how you're going to be evaluated. So we can complain about it, or we can do something about it and actually just do the work to get better at it. So let's talk about how you can get better at it. It does suck, but the DSA preparation is actually extremely high value in that it is one of the highest ROI things you can do. A little bit of prep can land you a 6-figure job. It can increase your income wildly. So it's worth thinking about how can you actually prepare. And it's a pretty big task to prepare for these leak code style, DSA style questions. The first thing I want to call out is that, as you are preparing, it's going to feel initially for the first few weeks, perhaps the first few months, that you're just not making very much progress. And so if we plot out on the x-axis time, how much time are you spending on preparation? On the y-axis, your understanding, it's going to feel pretty slow. Like you're going to go like that, and it's just going to feel like I'm not really getting that much better. But I want you to trust the process. For me, it took me a really long time to start to get comfortable. And then what you're going to find is after you've been doing this consistently, you really won't know what's happening. You're going to kind of feel sad. And then all of a sudden, you're going to find that things start to make sense. And your learning will increase exponentially because you've, at this point, observed tons and tons of patterns. And then this is the point after you've gone through that barrier where you're going to start passing a ton more interviews. So my advice is don't focus so much on your pass rate or your correctness rate initially. Just focus on hitting a certain number of problems every day or every week as per your schedule, and believe that it will get easier and easier over time as long as you have that faith. DSA is a big topic. There are literally thousands of questions that you could get asked by a company in the interview. It's impossible for a human to memorize solutions for all of that. And that's a common mistake I see, is that people think that, okay, I have enough time, or I'm gonna brute force my way through, and when I have this kind of problem, I'll know what code to write. That's a recipe for disaster. You're not gonna be dynamically prepared during the interview. So instead of trying to memorize hundreds of different algorithms or solutions, what you should instead do is figure out what are the common patterns that you see again and again and again. And it turns out there's only between 10 and 20, maybe a couple dozen maximum patterns that are going to be tested in the interview. So figure out what those are. And if you go to a website like LeetCode, you'll actually find those different categorizations. And so make sure you can understand the core concepts from each category, and then that'll prepare you for anything you might get asked instead of this narrow bucket of where you might memorize. On that topic, I really would encourage you, go deep on LeetCode. LeetCode is this company which has created the preeminent preparation tool for data structure and algorithm interviews. It's kind of like Xerox or Kleenex, where the brand has become so famous that people now associate the whole category with that brand. And that's for good reason. LeetCode is just so dominant in this space. There is a free product for LeetCode and a premium product. If you're preparing for tech interviews and you know that the companies are asking DSA problems, it feels like a no-brainer for me. Just get LeetCode Premium. It's, a little bit of money, but the outcome is that it could increase your income, your compensation, by literally thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. So the ROI is pretty obvious. And finally, one more tactical thing I want to share with you is that at the beginning we talked about learning how to code. And I talked about this idea of you want to embrace the discomfort. You want to be okay with not knowing how things are working and you struggle through it. That is where you get a lot of learning. The same exact concept applies here. So a lot of people who I talk to, they complain to me and say, hey, I'm not making any progress. I can't figure out LeetCode. And I prod them a little bit and say, how are you actually studying? And what they tell me is, hey, I try it for 5 minutes. I sit down with a paper or maybe on my computer and I try writing out a solution. After 5 minutes, I can't figure it out. I go look at the solution and I try and make sense of it. There's a binary switch that happens where they're either in problem-solving mode or in solution mode. And what I would encourage you to do is blur the line between problem-solving and solution finding. You're going to learn way deeper, way more in that way. And so here's what I'd recommend. When you are working on a problem, first of all, 5 minutes is too short. Give yourself a 15 or 20 or 30-minute struggle. Like a real interview is going to be 45 minutes. Give yourself more time to think about it and struggle. Then when you feel like you really cannot make any more progress, then instead of going fully into reading the solution, reveal it to yourself piecemeal. So look at one line of the solution, or if you're watching the explainer video, maybe go 30 seconds or 1 minute into the video. And when you feel like you've gotten a bit of a hint, stop and go back and struggle for 10 or 15 minutes more. Again, the idea is that you want to embrace the discomfort. Embrace the idea that you don't know what's happening. And when you reveal to yourself the solution a little bit at a time, your depth of understanding is going to be so much better. And you're going to be able to tackle the next problem and every other problem after that in a much more methodical and deeper way. Almost inevitably, you have heard about and thought about and worried about the DSA interview, data structure algorithm interview. Every software engineer talks about it and we make jokes about it. And yet, I would argue that there's another type of interview, the behavioral interview, which is more important than DSA. So obviously DSA is important. It's like a checkbox. You have to pass it and that's how you get the offer. But especially as you become more senior. I was a staff engineer at Meta. What I learned is that the behavioral interview is a much more important input to figure out how will this engineer operate in the company. And it's used to figure out, are you a mid-level, senior, or a staff engineer, or even higher? And so if you ignore the behavioral and you don't properly prepare for it, you might get down-leveled, you might not get the offer because it's such a core part of how big tech companies, and really any company that cares about culture, it's such a huge part of how they will evaluate you. A lot of engineers neglect the behavioral interview because they think that it's something they can easily just wing. And they walk in, they spout some story about a project or a teammate they had issue with, how they overcame it, and they'll pass. This could not be further from the truth. The best engineers I know are really targeted about what are they communicating and what does that story reveal about how they operate. So I would encourage you, spend a lot of time thinking about every sentence, every story you say in the behavioral interview should be lining up to one of 3 different buckets of what you're trying to communicate. So you have a behavioral interview, and there are 3 things that you're trying to communicate. And so when you think about the stories, it's either, number 1, you're going to be talking about how much you care about software engineering, the craft of writing code and building systems that are maintainable, and the intellectual pursuit of engineering. So either you're talking about that, or number 2, you are talking about the company. There are countless companies out there that could use software, and yet you're choosing to interview at this one. Why? And getting paid a bunch of money is not a good answer. You want to talk about, hey, this industry is really interesting to me, the problem space is interesting, the innovation at this company is exciting. Like, figure out how you can say something unique about the company in your behavioral answer, in whatever story you're talking about. And then finally, third is the team. Software engineering is not a solo endeavor. Hopefully you know that by now. Anything interesting will get built up on a team. You're going to be working with smart people and figuring out how to create something bigger and more maintainable than what you could have done alone. And so any story the third option for the behavioral interview is talking about how you had a particular run-in or a problem or a good incident, a good story with collaboration and teamwork. So when you think about interview, it really should be talking about either the craft of engineering, why you care about the company, the passion for the company, or third, your ability to interact and lead a team. And if you have that framework in mind, then you can be a lot more clear and a lot more concise with the answers that you're sharing in a behavioral interview. So I talked about the content of what you should be saying in a behavioral interview. There's also another whole discussion we could go into about how you say it. And this is really important. I'm not going to get too much into it here, but there's an acronym called STAR, which is a good starting point. STAR stands for situation, task, action, and result. And so as you talk about a particular story in the behavioral interview, you want to make sure you hit these 4 different bullet points as a way to logically explain to the interviewer what happened, what you did about it, what was the result, and what were the takeaways. And so if you have that framework thinking in mind, it'll help keep you on track with the interview. The third and final type of interview I want to talk about is system design. And the idea here is that you're given an open-ended prompt from the interviewer, for example, design Twitter or design a link shortener. And then your job in the interview is to decompose the problem into something that you can actually talk about and think about the trade-offs of how would you, high level, design a system, draw boxes, draw arrows, and figure out the relationship between the different components. Right off the bat, what you can tell from the description I just said is you are not coding. This is not a DSA, data structure algorithm problem, where you're writing a block of code and running it in the browser or in a compiler. If you're coding, then you are failing. So the idea of system design is to deliberately keep it high level and talk about the trade-offs of different approaches and not to actually implement anything. Another really common failure mode I see here is that people will read about, this big company is using Kafka, or they're using, this data infrastructure, or here's how they adopted this new open source technology to solve a problem. The system design interview is not about throwing out these hot new technologies or frameworks or open source tools. It's about how are you communicating the different options available to you? What are the assumptions that you're making about where the system might scale or break, and defending the decisions that you're making? So don't try and memorize the hot new frameworks that are coming out. Instead, focus on the actual problem being asked and think about what are the interesting design decisions on how this system might be built at a larger company. And I will say this is a pretty hard problem, because when you think about preparation, most people, especially early in their career, have a really hard time preparing. You don't really do system design in school. You're not building large-scale systems as a college student. If you're building a side project, again, you're usually not thinking about 100,000, a million, or 10 million users. You're usually doing something kind of in a sandbox environment. And third, even if you are on a job at a big tech company, if you're more junior, you're usually operating at the task level. Okay, here's a particular feature, write some code and implement it. And you don't really have the autonomy or authority to design a large scale system, for example, at the scale of Twitter or Facebook. And so how do you prepare? My number one piece of advice here is figure out really smart people who you can work with and figure out how are they designing systems. So you might not have first-hand experience, but you can at least observe how people are doing it. I have a funny story here. When I was working at Pinterest much earlier in my career, there was someone who, we called him Dr. Wei. Dr. Wei was quite senior, and it was such a privilege to be able to work with him because he was the one actually architecting these systems for Pinterest scale, 100 million, 200 million users going through the system. And that was where I feel like I learned a lot about properly thinking about trade-offs and drawing boxes on a whiteboard, which I had never really done before. So my advice to you is that if you have someone like a Dr. Wei who you can interact with, work really hard to be in the room where you can see how they're designing systems. And eventually, if you're doing good at your job, you will have earned the trust to build your own system. And that's where you can start to understand system design at a deeper level and illustrate that in the interview. So now we've talked a lot about interviewing and the different ways that you'll get evaluated, and now you have a job, hopefully. I want to spend the next few sections talking about how do you succeed on the job. And there's one really core idea that I want to begin with, which is what I would consider the secret to growing quickly. It's very simple. Be a feedback vacuum. I want you to suck up all the feedback you can possibly get and act on it. That is the number one trait I've observed from people who are able to grow their career very quickly. In fact, when I was at Facebook, there was a saying, which is that feedback is a gift. You should treat feedback and invite it with open arms because that is how you're able to figure out where you could improve. And there's no such thing as like a step-by-step guide on becoming the best engineer. There is going to be a lot of dynamic change and adaptation to the environment you're in. And so figuring out what the people around you are saying is a core part of growth. And you might hear that and say, yeah, of course feedback is a gift. I love feedback. I always invite it. But I would actually push you a little bit to really think about how open are you to hearing it and also to act on it. So what will often happen is a manager or a tech lead or someone will give you feedback and they'll say, you suck. And, hopefully they'll say it in a better way, in a more scoped down, say, hey, for this particular thing, you could probably have done this better. But, they'll give you some feedback, whether delivered well or not. And, a lot of people, if you're over here receiving the feedback, you might say initially, okay, I know. I got this feedback. I know I suck. And some people will just end it right there. And they say, okay, well, let me try and figure out what I can do. Or even worse, what people will do instead is they will start to become defensive. And they'll say, I disagree. And now you're pushing back on this person who gave you a gift. And if I gave you feedback and I felt like you were now attacking me or you were disagreeing with me, guess what? I probably will never give you feedback again because they were just a poor experience. I tried to do something which might be helpful, and even if I didn't deliver it in the most effective way, I'm now being punished for it. And so either you close down and don't really engage with feedback, or even worse, you are defensive. Both these are really bad outcomes for dealing with feedback. Instead, what you should do is ask a follow-up and say, what can I do? What can I do differently? What can I do better? And engage with them more and say, hey, that's really interesting to hear that. Can you give me an example of where I screwed that up? Or what do you think I could do differently going forward? And if you show that you're appreciative and you say thank you for the feedback, and then you ask really thoughtful follow-ups, and then a couple weeks later, you might even follow up and say, hey, you told me a month ago that I could improve how much I participate in meetings. I've been trying to do that more recently. What do you think? I think if you are able to do that, not only are you able to improve much more quickly, but you're also able to build up a really positive, trusted relationship with the people who are giving you feedback. And now they're gonna become an advocate for you. They'll think about you for promotion or a new project or generally for career advancement. One more really important point that I've seen again and again here is people who are questioning the validity of the feedback. And they might have a really legitimate claim to say, hey, you know what, that's factually not correct, or that feedback is simply not applicable to me. But here's the question I want you to ask. The person who's giving you the feedback, do they have good intention? Do they actually want you or the team to succeed? And if the answer is yes, you should still be very happy and inviting for that feedback, even if it's wrong. So what will often happen is if you're a junior engineer or you're a mid-level engineer, the person giving you feedback probably will be more busy than you, more senior than you. And because they're a lot more busy and they only have a small window of time to evaluate you or really make a judgment about you, they might very well come to the wrong conclusion. And despite that, the challenge for you is to treat the feedback as a gift, regardless of whether it is applicable to you or not. One last thing I want to mention on this topic is there's an art to being able to get feedback effectively. So a lot of people will, go out to their manager or people on the team and say, hey, do you have any feedback for me? Or is everything going okay? Like, you're giving people an out. You're giving them an opportunity to say, oh, you know what? Everything's fine. Don't worry about it. Instead, you should make it really easy for people to give you constructive feedback. So an example of that might be, hey, you know what? In the project that we worked on together last month, I felt like I wasn't really in control of it and I was being talked over and I wasn't in command of the project. What do you think? How could I have done that better? So now you're making it really easy for people to say, yeah, actually, I think you're right. What I could have done differently or what you probably should have done is X, Y, and Z. So making it really deliberate and thoughtful about wanting feedback and opening the door for them is important. One more tactic here is to plant the seed ahead of time. So if I haven't really worked with you that much and you spring upon me, hey, do you have any feedback for me? It's unlikely I'll have anything thoughtful to say to you. But if you give me a couple days and say, hey, Rahul, on Friday when we meet up, I would love to get from you any feedback. And now you gave me 3 or 4 days to be able to think of feedback. I'll be able to come into that conversation with something much more concrete and actionable. So try that out. These are ways for you to not only react to feedback you get, but also make sure that you get the feedback in the first place and make it easy for people around you. And if you do that consistently with a lot of people on your team, I promise you're gonna grow a lot faster in your career. Your career is made up of a bunch of stints at many jobs. And so it's really important that you're deliberate about what job are you picking next. How do you decide on the right company? So I'm gonna share a couple of heuristics that will be really valuable. The first thing I wanna mention is that you have to be deliberate. I can tell you pick company A or company B, but at the end of the day, it's gonna be your prioritization on what matters to you. And I think too many people are hand-wavy and ambiguous about this in their head. I want you to write down what exactly is important to you and realize that this is gonna change. And it's totally fine for your priorities to change in your 20s or 30s or when you have kids or have a house. All that will evolve, and that's okay. But think about things like compensation or learning or technology choice or work-life balance. There's probably 10 or 15 things that most people will consider. Make your list of what you really care about for now and change it every 6 months or every year. So that's what I would say is the framework of make that list and then figure out out of the opportunities available to you, which of these lines up with your internal compass of what you care about. That's a very theoretical answer. If I had to give you a bit more practical advice, what I would say is having that stamp of credibility from a big tech company, I'm talking mostly about FANG here, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, etc., that will unlock a ton of doors. And so unless you have a really well-known institute or academic university that you've been to, I encourage everyone when they're starting out in their career to go into big tech. And there's a couple benefits of that. Number one, it gives you credibility, which is gonna help you later on. Number two, it will give you a really solid foundation because you will inevitably be put into contact with really well-defined processes and really smart people that will help you level up. And third, it'll give you a financial cushion. You are going to be paid well if you are in FANG. And that money is a tool which you can now leverage for optionality and future choice. But be careful that you don't end up sticking around at the first company that you're at forever on autopilot. The tech industry moves rapidly. So a hot company today may not be a hot company tomorrow. Or if you, for example, join Google or Amazon, these companies are already enormous. They're trillion-plus-dollar companies. You will not see a 5 or 10x increase in the way that you would have if you had joined Google or Amazon or Meta in the 2000s. So just be realistic about that and realize that you have a lot more flexibility earlier on in your career, where if you've been working for 20 years, at that point you probably have accumulated some amount of responsibility, a mortgage, kids, and you'll probably have to think twice about joining a much earlier stage startup which won't have the liquidity. And so high level, my prescription would be early on in your career, go to a big name company, spend a couple of years there, and now once you have that foundation, then you move on to do your own company, join a startup, do something that you are more interested in. The main thing to keep in mind is don't put your career or put your job on autopilot. Just make a deliberate choice about what is important to you at this moment in your career, and is your company serving you appropriately. Hopefully you've done a lot of thinking about what is the correct company for the next chapter of your career, and now you are starting at this new company. Congratulations. I want to talk now about onboarding. How do you make sure that you succeed as the new engineer in the company? The first thing that's worth calling out is that I want you to view the onboarding period as a magical power that you now have. So I don't know if you've played Mario Kart before, but if you play Mario Kart, you have this star that you can absorb or eat. And then that gives you invincibility powers, where once you have that star, nothing can hurt you. That is effectively you as the noob on the team. So you are this new person. When you're brand new, you have this magical star which allows you to ask any number of questions and people will not get upset with you. It's expected. It's totally normal for you to interrupt people, have one-on-ones with them, figure out what they're doing, and you can just ask for help in a more aggressive way compared to maybe if you've been at the company for a year, it might not be as appropriate. And the reason I say that you should act with urgency, you should view this as a really sacred time, the first 1 month or 3 months or 6 months of the company, is because the power of that Mario star that you just ate is going to degrade over time. And the willingness of people to help you or pair program or do all these one-off things is going to be harder and harder over time. So as you're ramping up, talking to people, asking for resources, getting help, a really core part of showing that you're properly ramping up is you need to bias toward action. You need to get things done. So a very common failure mode is that people come in and they are really relaxed, lackadaisical about the onboarding, where, okay, I'm going to spend a bunch of time reading the documentation, reading the code, and there's no tangible output. And so I really would encourage you, figure out how you can create an artifact of your work. Oftentimes the most obvious artifact for a software engineer is going to be code. Did you manufacture, did you produce code, a pull request that people can then review? It also, the benefit of code is that it also forces a level of interaction because usually people are going to have to review your code. Another common artifact could be documentation, like put together a wiki, improve the onboarding guide. Have something that you are putting out into the world, hands on keyboard, that people could give you feedback on. That is a really powerful indicator that you're ramping up appropriately if you are creating something as quickly as possible. The other big thing about the onboarding is that it's a time for you to build up relationships. You're going to be obviously interacting with your manager, tech lead, other people on the team, because you have this Mario Golden Star to be able to request help and interact with them. I want you to view all of these interactions as your goal is to have a really deep relationship where people come away from the interaction saying, wow, that new person on the team is really friendly, really easy to work with. I want to spend more time with them. You want to be very likable. And that means figuring out what they care about, trying to help if you can, even in the early days, buy them a coffee, do whatever you can to create that relationship built on trust that will then serve you for however long you are at the company. I did a really poor job of this actually when I joined Pinterest. So I came in through this acqui-hire scenario, and I was transitioning from a machine learning role at the startup, and then I made a decision that at Pinterest I would do more mobile development. I wanted to do Android. And it was a combination of that along with just frankly being kind of lazy. I didn't really engage as much as I should have with the team or with the new tech stack in Android. And the result was pretty awful. I got rejected for the promotion from L3 to L4, not once, but twice. And it was really disheartening. And I attribute a lot of my slow progression and my failure to just not having that proper sense of urgency when it comes to onboarding. So don't be like me. Make sure you come in, build up a ton of relationships, ask a lot of questions, and bias toward action when you're new. When it comes to your professional growth, the single most important person is going to be your manager. Without your manager's approval, without a good relationship with your manager, you will not succeed in your career. You can kiss your promotion goodbye. It's not going to happen unless your manager and you are on the same page. So I want to spend a couple minutes talking about how to make that manager relationship healthy and productive. Here's what a lot of people think, especially when they're new in the industry or new to a company. Here's what they think the manager relationship is like. I have my EM, my Eng manager, and then you are down here. And they think that the manager is this authority figure above them. And they're going to be sending commands down this pipe, do this, do that, report back to me about this particular problem. And then your job is, okay, let me nod along and basically do what they say. And don't get me wrong, your manager is your boss. They control your compensation, perhaps. They probably will give you feedback about what you should do. But this is not the correct way to view that relationship. Let's cross that out. This is not how you should be interacting with your manager. Instead, a healthier way of thinking about the manager relationship is to be more of a peer-to-peer relationship. So if I draw it like this, now it should be more of you're on somewhat more of equal footing, where of course your manager will be giving you continuous feedback about what you should be doing or what you shouldn't be doing, but you should also feel empowered to communicate back. And it could just be as simple as, hey, here's what would help me. Could you maybe give me more feedback in this area or that area? Or you could even take a step further and say, hey, here's what I think you should do to help the team. Here's what you could be doing differently or better. When you have this bi-directional relationship with your manager, not only do you feel more empowered to take action and do things that you think are important, but also, critically, as a manager, I will trust you way more when it feels like you're in control and you're giving me feedback. I'm not just talking to a passive participant. It's someone who actually cares. When it comes to building up that relationship with the manager, the most important tool in your toolkit is going to be the one-on-one. So ideally, you're going to have some sort of recurring meeting, half an hour, 45 minutes, every week or two with your manager, where you talk about how things are going. Not just about how are you doing, how is the team doing, talk about what could be going better or what's going well. And so a core part of the one-on-one is having a one-on-one document where you write down what exactly it is that you want to talk about and what you talked about in the past. And so I really would encourage you, everyone should have a one-on-one doc where you have the date and you talk about, on that particular date, what is the agenda? And this goes back to this idea of a bidirectional relationship. It should not just be your manager filling out this document. I want you to be proactive enough that ahead of the meeting, you write down, here's what's top of mind for me. And the byproduct of having this document is, number one, it shows that you care. And oftentimes what you'll find in your career or in life in general, when you care, other people care. And so that's why the one-on-one doc is so important. The second big thing is that it also makes it super easy for both you and your manager to remember what it is that you've done or what it is that you've talked about. Your manager likely is going to be busier than you. They might have 5 or 10 people reporting to them. They have a lot going on in their head. You want to make it really easy for your manager to remember what impact you've had and how you've been working with them so they can advocate for you appropriately when it comes time for performance review. So make sure you think about the relationship in a bidirectional way. Come prepared to the meetings with a one-on-one document and have thoughts to share. And that is how you set yourself up for a really healthy manager relationship. All right, so now you have found a company, you've onboarded, you have hopefully a good working relationship with your manager. Question is, how do you now progress in your company? And oftentimes the most tangible marker of career progression is going to be promotion. Promotion is a really broad topic. I'm not going to do it justice here, but I want to share a couple tidbits, a couple things that I've observed in my own career and from seeing so many people go through it. A lot of people think that promotion is about doing more work and doing it faster. This is not how you will actually get promoted. It's not, okay, like you do 5 tasks per week and now I'm doing 6 tasks or 7 tasks per week. I'm going to get compensated more and get promoted. This is a core unlock in my mindset as I was thinking about promotion. Promotion is about behavior, not output. I'll say it again. Promotion is about behavior, not output. It's not about how quickly can you churn through different tasks. It's about how are you approaching the work in a way that allows you to tackle problems that you could not have tackled earlier in your career. And that comes it might come from working harder, but oftentimes it's about changing the type of work that you're doing, the relationship with the other people on the team or in the company to unlock a higher level of impact. One way to prove this is that if you look at the compensation for different levels of engineer, if you're an entry-level engineer at Facebook, then you might get paid, let's say, $150K a year. And then it goes up to $180K a year as an L4. But then if you kind of forecast that out, it's not like your compensation goes up linearly. Your compensation actually goes up geometrically, where if you're the senior most level, like E8 or E9, you will get paid literally 10x more than the entry-level engineer. But we all have 24 hours in the day. It's not like the E8 engineer, the distinguished engineer, or the principal engineer has 10 times more hours in the day. And so what they're doing is they're able to tackle problems and they're able to handle a scope far, far beyond what the entry-level E3 engineer is able to handle. So the question is, how does that E7, E8 engineer do so much more? And the answer comes from multiplicative impact. So a lot of people, when they start off their career, which is totally a fine place to be, is they write code, and that code will get shipped to the end user, and they get some amount of impact. They write about that in their performance review, and everyone's happy. When you get to a more senior level, though, when you get promoted, then you start to actually have multiplicative impact. And what that means is one way that might manifest is you are now influencing the code of every person on the team. So now you're writing code, or you're maybe mentoring people, you're coaching people, and your impact, whatever positive impact you have on one person because of the code or the mentorship, can be multiplied by 5 or 10 people on the team. And all of their impact now, you are able to get some credit for that. And so what would have taken you much, much longer if you had done the actual work on your own, the code or the people are able to scale that up in a way that would not have been possible earlier. And that's how you're able to justify 10x more compensation or 10x more impact. As you think about promotion, as you think about the type of work that you're doing, and hopefully it'll shift toward more multiplicative work, you need to think about how does that actually line up to create a narrative around promotion? How can you justify promotion? Promotions rarely just happen because you're doing good work. There is some deliberate thinking and planning that goes into it. So if you care about career growth, if you care about promotion, it needs to be a discussion with your manager. But there is a right and a wrong way to have that conversation. The wrong way would be, hey, I really want to get promoted. I've been working so hard and I feel like I deserve it. That kind of statement or that kind of interaction is very me-focused. A better way of having the promotion conversation is to frame the career growth, your career growth, as a benefit to the team, to the manager, and to the company. And you talk about how if you're able to get promoted, you're going to have even more impact, more credibility, more ability to help the team and the manager have even more impact. So the way you have that conversation matters. The timing of that conversation also matters, where you need to make it aware. You need to make your manager aware that you care about this promotion and get that feedback from them early enough that you can adapt or improve upon any of the feedback that they might have for you. I've gotten promoted a bunch in my career. I've also gotten rejected for a promotion a bunch in my career. I mentioned this earlier in the video, but I actually got rejected for the same promotion twice at Pinterest. And a large part of it was that I just expected my manager to advocate for me and help me out. And I wasn't an active participant in that promotion process as much as I could have been. For example, in the second time that I got rejected for the promo, I had written in my promotion packet that I worked on a particular project for about 18 months. I said I worked on this for 18 months. Turns out that the promo committee read that and made a judgment that I wasn't working fast enough or I wasn't prioritizing my time correctly for why this project should have taken me 18 months. And that's the kind of thing that I easily could have caught earlier if I had shared my packet with my manager or with peers ahead of time. Don't leave the promotion up to chance. Be really buttoned up and thoughtful about who you're getting feedback from and anticipate how it might be perceived. I want to spend a few minutes talking about negotiation, which is, in my opinion, one of the highest leverage activities you can partake in to meaningfully change your life financially. I'm going to share the anecdote from one of the most famous essays about negotiation. I'll leave a link for it. It's from Pandey 11. And he tells a story of, what if I told you that you have to recite 10 minutes of poetry standing on one leg to an empty room. And if you do that, I'm going to give you $50,000. You would be stupid not to do it. It's a little bit of pressure, a little bit of preparation you need to do. And yet, if you do it, 10 minutes of time, you say some poetry, and then you're going to have a huge sum of money waiting for you. That is the analog to negotiation. If you're able to come in with a script, a little bit of preparation, it might be uncomfortable, I'll acknowledge that, but the outcome could be so beneficial for you if you're able to persist. A lot of people I talk to, they think that, okay, you were already so well paid in the tech industry. For me, that was certainly true. I had never seen that much money in my life when I was 22 years old and I landed this job, right? So a lot of people think in tech that if I negotiate, I am ungrateful for what I have. I'm already so handsomely paid. But the rule of capitalism is that companies will pay you as little as they possibly can to get you to do the work for them. And if you just ask in a polite way, in a way that is framed as a win-win, you could actually come to an offer, a negotiation, where you're able to have meaningfully more money and the company is also happy with the outcome. So I'm going to share a few tidbits of negotiation that have helped me negotiate more than $500,000 of an increase in a single offer. And there's a lot more I could talk about. I'll leave a link for the course in the description. But I'll share 3 quick tidbits. Number 1, and this is something you've probably heard, is don't share a number first. When you are revealing a number at the beginning of a negotiation, you're effectively showing your hand, and the company can then take advantage of you. So wait until you have gotten confirmation that the company wants to give you an offer, and then let them give an offer first. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is make the negotiation multidimensional. And this is where, in the tech industry, we have a huge advantage, where your compensation is not just your salary. You probably will have a salary, an annual bonus, equity. You might have PTO, like paid time off. These are all opportunities for you to say, I want more of this and less of that. And if you figure out the right combination, that is how you're able to create a win-win scenario. And then finally, tip number 3 is I want you to negotiate over email or over writing rather than verbally over the phone or in a VC call. There's a huge information asymmetry between the recruiter, the company, and you. They probably have 100 or 1,000x more data points about what is a reasonable compensation. They probably have a lot better idea, frankly, of the psychology that you're going through when you have the offer. And that information will be used to take advantage of you. And so instead of negotiating over a phone call where you might have a lot of pressure, I want you to be really deliberate about the words you're using, the phrasing that you're using, and put that in an email to be able to ask for what you want. And if you're able to do that, and you have multiple offers, you have leverage, I am very confident you can see a meaningful change in your total compensation with negotiation. One more tactical thing I'll share is what I call closing the deal. And what that means is when you have an offer that you're comfortable taking, you can tell the recruiter, hey, I am willing to sign on the dotted line if you're able to meet me at this number. And you can be strategic about that number. It could just be a signing bonus. It could be a slightly higher salary. But at that point, the company is clearly committed to you. They've given you an offer. You might have already done a little bit of negotiation. So they're vested in having you come join the company. And so when you have this tactic of, hey, I'm prepared to sign, I give you my word that I will join the company if you can meet me here, you will often be able to get that little bit of extra compensation at the end. Okay, we've covered a lot at this point. We've talked about how should you actually learn how to code and debug and build up those fundamental skills. How can you interview to get the job that you want? And once you have the job, onboarding, working with your manager, promotion, how do you succeed on the job? One topic that we haven't touched on too much is about how do you balance all the things that we talked about career growth and progression with your actual life. There's so many things that you could do outside of work, and those are equally or more important than what you do at work. I want to spend a couple minutes sharing what I've learned, what I have observed in my time as a software engineer. A lot of people think that their work-life balance is dictated by their company. So for example, Amazon and Meta to a lesser degree, but Amazon and Meta have pretty bad work-life balance. And so I've talked to a ton of engineers at Amazon, and they throw their hands up and say, hey, I work at Amazon. My life sucks. I should expect it to suck because I work at this hard-working company. I'm not going to have too much time on weeknights or weekends to hang out with my family or do things I like. And that's just simply not true. You shouldn't accept that just because your company has a harder work culture, that means that you have to give up your free time. A lot of your ability to balance work and life is going to be dependent on, number one, your team and what are the mechanics of your team in terms of on-call and workload. And you can shape that, by the way. If you're senior enough, you can actually share opinions and talk about how to make it more tolerable. And secondly, it'll also be dictated by you. What are you willing to do? And you can make a choice that you really want to prioritize family or non-work life, and that's totally fine. You may not progress in your career as much as other people, but that's totally a reasonable choice to make. And if you broadcast that to your manager or to your team, you can calibrate and set expectations appropriately. One tactic I like to use, which has been super effective for me, is to have a hard stop. So for me, it might be pickleball or soccer, or I like to just run around after work. So I'll pick a sport and I'll tell a friend, hey, at 5:30 or 6 p.m., we are going to go play pickleball. I'll meet you here at this location. And there's a magical thing that happens because not only does it obviously force me to stop working, but I find that during the day, because I'm excited about that event and I know there's a hard stop, I actually become more productive. I am forced to work hard and also prioritize what do I want to achieve before this deadline. And that's the second thing I wanted to communicate about work-life balance, is that the people who are best at having time to themselves or to their family, they are really, really good at prioritization. They're at a tech company where things are constantly growing and breaking and new people are joining and people are leaving. There's always an infinite number of things to do. And so your job as an engineer and working with your manager, working with your team, your job is to figure out what are the top few things that will actually matter, what will actually move the needle. And then be really clear that you're not going to spend time on all the things that might feel like work, that you might feel like, okay, someone's asking me, but they're not really that important. And if you have that crystal clear prioritization list, you'll have a much easier time balancing how many hours you're spending on the day job. And I'll be honest that I'm not that good at maintaining work-life balance, especially now that I'm working on Tara, which is my own company for the past 2 years. There is a sense of I just want to push through and get everything done, reply to all the emails, get all the work done. So, I definitely can't claim to be an expert at this, but I do think that's another element of work-life balance, that it will come in phases. A certain chapter of your career, you might really prioritize going hard at work. Another chapter, you might not. And it could also be at the micro level where, hey, on weekdays, I'm just going to focus on work. I'm okay spending until 8 or 9 p.m. But then weekends are your sacred time where you're not going to touch your computer. You're going to go outside. You're going to hang out with family. Just be clear, be deliberate about what parts of your life you really want to protect from work and where you're okay to have it bleeding over. And if you have that, at least you won't have the resentment that a lot of people in tech end up having. Okay, if you have watched all the way through the video up until here, thank you for sticking around. I said it at the beginning of the video that a 1 hour, 2 hour video is not gonna magically make you an amazing engineer. That's still true. So I want you to view this video as a starting point, as a jumping off point to go a lot deeper into the tech industry and really supercharge your growth. I have a startup called Taro, jointaro.com, and we've actually made full-length courses that dive deep into almost every single topic that I touched on in this video. And by watching that, I promise you, you're going to be able to avoid so many of the mistakes that people make in the tech industry. You're going to be able to supercharge your growth and your career in a way that I wish I could have done earlier on. My goal with this channel and with Taro is just to help people thrive in tech. So I really would appreciate any feedback you have. Leave a comment about problems you have or what other videos you want to see, and I'll do my best to make them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.